It was the most brutal night of my life, one that shattered everything I thought I knew about family. Just weeks before my high school finals, the exams that would determine my entire future, I was told to leave the only home I'd ever known. My parents didn't even try to sugarcoat it. They made it clear I was disposable. The reason? My half-sister Sasha, 6 years older than me and someone who had never treated me as family, needed space because she was pregnant. Never mind that I was 18, on the verge of adulthood, but still dependent on them for support. Never mind that my finals were days away, and my dreams hung by a thread. The betrayal cut deeper when Jacob, the man I could never call dad, took matters into his own hands. That night, while I was frantically cramming for an exam I wasn't sure I'd live through emotionally, I stumbled upon my belongings dumped unceremoniously in the hallway. My textbooks, clothes, and photo albums all stacked like trash outside my bedroom door. It felt symbolic, really. This wasn't just about making room for Sasha. This was their way of saying I'd always been an outsider in my own home. Every item left there seemed to scream how little I mattered to them. When I confronted them, Mom refused to meet my eyes, and Jacob sneered, "You're an adult now. Figure it out." No apologies. No acknowledgement of the storm they were unleashing in my life. As I packed under the weight of their indifference, tears blurred my vision, not from sadness alone, but from rage at being treated like an inconvenience rather than a daughter. They weren't just kicking me out, they were erasing me. And as I walked out that door with nothing but 2 duffel bags and a heart full of bitterness, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just abandonment, it was rejection. TT2. When Sasha walked back into our lives, it wasn't with open arms or even a hint of sisterly affection. It was more like a storm rolling in, leaving destruction in its wake. She arrived 2 days before my finals week, her presence announced not by hugs but by demands. At 24 years old, Sasha had always carried herself as though she were entitled to everything life could offer, and, apparently, that now included my room. The audacity of her request stunned me at first. I thought it was some cruel joke when she casually declared over dinner that I'd need to sacrifice my space for the sake of her pregnancy. Sacrifice. For someone who had treated me like an outsider since childhood. Sasha didn't stop there. In front of her boyfriend and our parents, she mocked me without restraint. "Honestly," she said with a smirk, glancing at her partner for validation, "she's never really been part of this family anyway." Her words hit harder than any slap ever could. It wasn't just what she said, it was how everyone else reacted. My mother nodded along sympathetically, while Jacob barely concealed his smug grin. They weren't defending me because they agreed with her. To them, I was expendable. But Sasha's cruelty didn't end with insults. Oh no, she took it further, spinning tales about how unsafe her current apartment was for her unborn child. She claimed she couldn't bear being alone during her partner's work trips, painting herself as a fragile victim, desperate for protection. Yet, behind closed doors, I overheard her laughing on the phone with friends about how much money they'd save by moving back home. Why pay rent when Mom and Dad are so eager to help? She giggled, completely unbothered by the chaos she was causing. That moment confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't about her baby's safety, it was about convenience and greed. The worst part? No one seemed to care about the impact this decision would have on me. As Sasha lounged around the house, acting as if she owned the place, I scrambled to find alternatives. Every suggestion I made, like staying in the living room temporarily or sharing her old office-turned-bedroom, was shot down immediately. Jacob dismissed these ideas with cold indifference, saying, "That's not realistic. You're an adult now. Figure it out." Meanwhile, Sasha feigned concern whenever I protested, pretending to weigh options she had no intention of considering. "It's for the baby," she'd say sweetly, knowing full well those 3 words silenced any argument against her. As tensions escalated, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about reclaiming her childhood, bedroom, or saving cash, it was about asserting dominance. Sasha saw me as nothing more than a nuisance, someone standing between her and what she wanted. And my parents. They let her walk all over me, proving once again that I was nothing more than a pawn in their twisted game of favoritism. By the time they gave me the ultimatum to leave by the end of the week, or be thrown out. Ty felt less like their daughter and more like a stranger they'd tolerated for too long. TT3. When I found myself standing on the doorstep of my paternal relatives, desperation clawing at my chest, I thought at the very least they'd offer some semblance of support. After all, blood is supposed to be thicker than water, right? How naive I was. The moment I walked into their home, the air grew heavy with disdain. Their eyes raked over me like I was an unwelcome shadow, a reminder of everything they resented about my mother and her choices. My mother's divorce from my biological father had left a bitter taste in their mouths, one that lingered long after she remarried Jacob. To them, I wasn't family, I was a burden, a living testament to her failures. The worst part came when Uncle Greg, a man I barely recognized, but who seemed determined to make his opinion known, spoke up. His voice dripped with venom as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, sneering down at me. "You should be grateful," he said coldly, his words slicing through me like knives. "Jacob put up with you for years. Do you think anyone else would have done the same? Grateful. For what? Being treated as an outsider in my own home? For being tossed out like garbage just because Sasha decided she wanted to save money on rent?" His words weren't just cruel, they were calculated, designed to remind me that I didn't belong anywhere, not even among people who shared my last name. No one else spoke up to defend me. Instead, they exchanged glances filled with pity or thinly veiled contempt. Aunt Linda muttered something under her breath about how these things always happen when families fall apart, while Cousin Ryan avoided eye contact altogether, pretending to scroll through his phone as if my presence made him uncomfortable. It was clear, none of them saw me as worth their time or effort. They viewed me as collateral damage in my mother's messy life, a girl whose existence only complicated their pristine image of perfection. I tried to explain myself, to plead for understanding, but it felt futile. Every word I uttered seemed to deepen their disapproval. When I mentioned needing help to figure out college or simply somewhere temporary to stay until I got back on my feet, Uncle Greg scoffed loudly. "College? You really think we're going to waste our hard-earned money on someone like you?" He spat, shaking his head in disgust. Someone like me? Those 3 words echoed in my mind long after I left their house, haunting me like a ghost I couldn't escape. Walking away from that encounter, I realized something devastating. There was no safety net for me. No family member was waiting in the wings to catch me when I fell. My mother's side of the family had abandoned her and, by extension, my years ago. And now, my father's relatives had made it abundantly clear where I stood in their hierarchy of priorities. Nowhere. As I trudged toward my best friend's house yet again, tears streaming down my face, I understood that survival wouldn't come from relying on others. It would have to come from within me. The call from my grandparents came out of nowhere, a shockwave that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family's history. When they introduced themselves over the phone, their voices trembled with emotion, hopeful yet hesitant, as if afraid I'd reject them too. But it wasn't until we FaceTimed for the first time that the full weight of their presence hit me. They held up old photo albums, filled with pictures of my mother from her youth, smiling, carefree, surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. This version of my mother was unrecognizably stark contrast to the cold, distant woman I had grown up with. Seeing those images felt like staring into an alternate reality where things could have been so different. My chest tightened as tears streamed down my face, not just from joy at finally meeting them, but from the overwhelming realization of how much pain and manipulation I had endured. As they flipped through the pages, pointing out memories frozen in time, they began to explain the truth behind their estrangement from my mother. Their words painted a heartbreaking picture of betrayal and loss. They hadn't abandoned her when she became pregnant with Sasha. Instead, they had begged her to leave Jacob, offering financial support and a safe haven away from his toxic influence. "We weren't against her having Sasha," Grandma said softly, her voice cracking under the weight of decades-old grief. "We were against him." She gestured toward one of the photos, a younger Jacob, looking smug and arrogant even then. According to them, he was a well-known addict back in high school and college, someone no one trusted. My grandparents feared he would drag my mother down with him, and they pleaded with her to end things. For a while, She listened. She broke up with him and allowed them full custody of Sasha during her infancy. But Jacob eventually cleaned up, at least temporarily, and my mother fell right back into his orbit. What hurt the most was learning how hard they had tried to reconnect after my birth. Despite their efforts, Jacob poisoned my mother against them, convincing her that they were controlling and judgmental. The final straw came when my mother chose Jacob over them not once, but twice. First, when she reconciled with him despite his relapses, and second, when she refused to let them meet me after I was born. She told us she needed space, Grandpa said bitterly, shaking his head. But every time we reached out, she pushed us further away. Their story left me reeling. It wasn't just the revelation itself, it was the knowledge that my entire life had been shaped by lies. My mother had painted them as villains, using their absence to justify her loyalty to Jacob. Yet here they were, desperate to make amends, carrying the scars of rejection and heartbreak. As I looked at their weathered faces on the screen, I realized something profound. They weren't strangers, they were victims of my mother's choices, just like I was. And now, they were reaching out not just to save me, but to reclaim the family they had lost. It had been a year since I last heard from my parents, year of silence that felt like both a curse and a blessing. So, when my mother's email landed in my inbox one ordinary afternoon, it was as if the past came crashing back with full force. The subject line read, "We miss you," but the content reeked of insincerity. Her words were coated in honeyed phrases. "I've realized how much we hurt you, or we want to make things right, but something about them didn't sit well with me." Call it intuition, call it years of knowing her manipulative tactics. But I could feel the ulterior motive lurking beneath every sentence. Still, part of me wanted to believe she meant it. Maybe they regretted kicking me out. Maybe they finally saw me as more than just an inconvenience. But then came the second email, and with it, the mask slipped completely. When I didn't respond to her initial attempt at reconciliation, her tone shifted from sweetly apologetic to venomously accusatory. She called me ungrateful, selfish, and entitled all for simply choosing not to engage with her lies again. "After everything we've done for you," she wrote, "this is how you repay us." It was laughable, really. Everything they had done for me. They abandoned me when I needed them most, forcing me to fend for myself at 18 while juggling high school finals and no safety net. And now, suddenly I owed them. The final email arrived 2 days later, and by that point, any pretense of civility was gone. Her words were sharp daggers aimed straight at my heart. "If you don't come home this weekend, consider yourself cut off forever," she threatened, as though severing ties would somehow devastate me. But the line that hit hardest, the one that made my blood run cold, was her cruel wish. "I wish you'd died in that car accident with your father. Then maybe Sasha wouldn't have had to deal with the burden of having you around." Reading those words felt like being punched in the gut. How could someone who claimed to be my mother say such a thing? What infuriated me most wasn't even the cruelty itself. It was the realization that none of this was about repairing our relationship. This wasn't about missing me or wanting to reconnect. It was about saving their own skin. A week prior, my grandparents had contacted me, revealing the truth about the house, the same house my parents were desperate to keep. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Their sudden interest in mending fences wasn't born out of love or regret, it was desperation. They knew the jig was up, and they were scrambling to salvage what little control they still had over the situation. By the time I finished reading her tirade, I felt nothing but disgust. My mother wasn't reaching out because she cared, she was reaching out because she was scared. Scared of losing the life she'd built on lies. Scared of facing the consequences of her actions. But I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me anymore. Not after everything she'd put me through. If anything, her emails only solidified my resolve. Whatever bond we once had, if it could even be called, that was long dead. To me, she wasn't family anymore. Family doesn't threaten to erase you from existence. Family doesn't wish you were dead. The truth about the house's ownership became the turning point that empowered me to take control of my life. My grandparents revealed not only that they had gifted the house to my parents, but also that its deeds still bore their names, giving them and ultimately me the authority to decide who truly deserved to stay. This revelation wasn't just about property, it was about justice. For years I had been treated as disposable, cast out without hesitation when it suited them. Now, armed with this knowledge and my grandparents' trust, I faced the hardest decision of my life, whether to give my family another chance or to make them leave the home they had once used to betray me. It felt surreal holding the power to dismantle the very foundation of their comfort, but deep down, I knew what I had to do. When my grandparents handed me the power to decide whether my family could stay in the house or be evicted, I felt like Atlas carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. It was an impossible choice. Let them keep living in a home they didn't deserve, or finally take back control and make them face the consequences of their actions. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same house where I had been thrown out like trash just a year ago, forced to abandon everything while Sasha and Jacob moved in, as if they were royalty. Now, it was my turn to hold all the cards. I wrestled with guilt at first. What kind of person would kick their own family out onto the streets? But then I remembered what they had done to me, the way Jacob sneered when he told me I was no longer welcome, the way my mother coldly referred to Sasha's children as her real grandkids, and how Sasha never once treated me like a sister. They hadn't hesitated to cast me aside when it suited them. Why should I hesitate now? My grandparents assured me that whatever decision I made, they would support me fully. Still, the thought of being labeled a villain weighed heavily on my mind. In the end, I chose justice over mercy. I told my grandparents that I wanted my family out of the house not because I hated them, but because I believed it was time for them to experience even a fraction of the instability they had forced upon me. When my grandparents delivered the news, the explosion was immediate. My mother called me screaming, hurling insults so vile I almost couldn't recognize her voice. She accused me of ruining her life, of betraying her after everything she'd supposedly done for me. Sasha took things further by taking her grievances online, posting long rants, accusing me of being heartless and immoral. She threw us out during the holidays. She wrote in one particularly dramatic post, "How can anyone live with themselves after doing something so cruel?" The backlash hit me hard. Friends of Sasha and Jacob started flooding my social media with hateful comments, calling me selfish and ungrateful. Some even went so far as to say I was jealous of Sasha's perfect family life. For days I felt like I was drowning under the weight of public judgment. Strangers who knew nothing about my story were quick to condemn me, believing the narrative Sasha Pentita, poor pregnant woman, unfairly ousted by her bitter half-sister. It stung more than I cared to admit, but deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity and showing my family that their toxic behavior wouldn't go unpunished forever. Despite the storm raging around me, I found solace in knowing I had made the right decision. My grandparents stood firmly by my side, shielding me from the worst of the fallout. And slowly, as the dust settled, I realized something profound. I wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in years, I truly belonged to my grandparents, to my best friend's family, and most importantly, to myself. Life after evicting my family was far from easy, but it was undeniably worth every challenge. The first few weeks felt like walking through a storm. Sasha unleashed her fury, not just in private messages to me, but also publicly on social media. She posted venomous rants accusing me of being heartless and destroying our family, painting herself as the victim while conveniently omitting how they had cast me out without hesitation. Her words spread like wildfire, drawing criticism from strangers who didn't know the full story. My phone buzzed constantly with hateful messages calling me selfish, ungrateful, and even cruel. For days, I couldn't escape the feeling that everyone around me was judging my choices. It was suffocating, as if the weight of their opinions pressed down on my chest. But amidst the chaos, there was light. My grandparents became my anchor. They stood by me unwaveringly, shielding me from Sasha's attacks and reminding me why this decision mattered. "You're doing the right thing," Grandma would say, holding my hand during particularly dark moments. Their support gave me strength when self-doubt crept in. Slowly, I began reconnecting with extended family members I'd never met before, thanks to my grandparents' efforts. Cousins, aunts, and uncles welcomed me warmly, eager to make up for lost time. Each conversation felt like piecing together fragments of a puzzle I hadn't realized was incomplete. The house itself transformed into something new, a symbol of healing rather than pain. With my grandparents now living there full-time, laughter filled its halls again. Even my old room, once a space tainted by memories of betrayal, felt comforting after they redecorated it with care. Yet, forgiving the past wasn't easy. Nights were often restless, haunted by flashes of Jacob's cold stares or Sasha's mocking grin. But over time, those wounds began to scar, replaced by gratitude for the life I was building. One evening, sitting at dinner surrounded by loved ones, I realized something profound. I no longer needed validation from people who refused to see my worth. Sasha could scream all she wanted about fairness, but fairness wasn't hers to define anymore. This was my chapter now, one filled with resilience, love, and hope. And though the scars of my childhood might never fully fade, they reminded me of how far I'd come and how much stronger I'd become because of them. The day of the Thanksgiving dinner arrived, and as I stood in the kitchen of my childhood home, now filled with laughter and warmth, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. This house had once been a prison of pain, its walls echoing with memories of betrayal and rejection. It was here that Jacob sneered at me when he told me to leave, here where Sasha mocked me for being an outsider, and here where my mother chose her precious real family over me. But now, it felt different. The air smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon, not tension and tears. My grandparents buzzed around, decorating every corner with care, while my best friend helped set the table. For the first time in years, this place felt like home. As guests began arriving, family members I'd never met before, friends who supported me through my darkest days, watched them fill the rooms that once felt so empty. Every laugh, every hug, felt like a defiant act against the past. Even the dining room, where I'd argued with my parents about leaving, now glowed with candles and shared stories. Yet, amidst the joy, there were moments when the weight of everything hit me again. When I passed by the hallway where Jacob had dumped my belongings, I froze, my chest tightening. Memories flooded back, sharp and unrelenting. But then my grandmother placed a hand on my shoulder, pulling me back to the present. "This is your fresh start," she whispered. That night, as we sat around the table sharing gratitude, I realized something profound. This wasn't just a celebration, it was a declaration. A declaration that I had survived their cruelty, rebuilt myself from ashes, and reclaimed what was stolen from me. The house no longer represented loss. It symbolized rebirth. Still, as I looked at the faces gathered around me, I reminded myself of one truth I would carry forever. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. And though I had found peace, I would never allow myself to forget the lessons those scars had taught me.